In 2020, Azerbaijan launched a large-scale offensive on Nagorno Karabakh, leading to the deaths of thousands and loss of control over some of its territories by Armenians. As a result of the indiscriminate attacks, the indigenous Armenian civilian population of Nagorno Karabakh was forced to flee their homes. On November 9, a ceasefire was established through a trilateral agreement between Azerbaijan, Armenia, and Russia. As part of this agreement, the safety of the only corridor connecting Nagorno-Karabakh to Armenia was to be secured by Russian peacekeepers. After months of relative peace and occasional local attacks, on December 12, 2022, Azerbaijan blocked the Lachin corridor, the only route connecting Nagorno-Karabakh to Armenia. For over 9 months, 120,000 people in Nagorno-Karabakh were under a complete blockade, deprived of basic necessities for survival. People were forced to stand in long queues for bread as shops ran out of food and essentials. Azerbaijan also sabotaged the gas pipeline, leaving the population of Nagorno-Karabakh without gas and electricity in the harsh winter cold. Throughout the blockade, the international community urged Azerbaijan to open the road of life, but these pleas went unanswered. Azerbaijan refused to reopen the Lachin corridor, even after the International Criminal Court issued a legally binding order instructing Azerbaijan to ensure the unimpeded movement of people, vehicles, and goods along the corridor in both directions. Despite these efforts, the people of Nagorno-Karabakh were left isolated and alone. On September 19, 2023, Azerbaijan launched a large-scale attack on Nagorno-Karabakh, leading to the forced displacement of the entire population. With the tacit approval of Russian peacekeepers, Azerbaijan targeted the population that had already been under blockade for 9 months. During the 2-day assault, 223 people were killed, including 20 civilians, 6 of whom were minors.
Razmik, Martik, Arturik, Hetq, Asim Haurtamir.
Saren is recalling the names of his relatives lost to the continuous war and its aftermath. Among the miners killed by Azerbaijan were Saren's 2 brothers, Never and Mikhail Gazarian. The Gazarian family lived in the village of Sarnakbir. On the day of the attack, Zaren's 4 sons were in the village, while she was in the Skarin, where she had gone with fellow villagers to get food.
When we arrived in Askeran, we learned that the war had broken out. My mother-in-law told us that my brother-in-law, Martik, had informed them of the situation and said we needed to evacuate the children from the village. I called the village mayor and said, "Garik, a war has started, get the kids out of the village." But he reassured me that nothing was happening and it was just panic.
8 and 10 years old brothers, Never and Mikhail, were sent home from school. Their 5-year-old brother Saren was at home, while their youngest brother Karin was staying with a relative. The village mayor urged a neighbor to take the children to a nearby valley in an attempt to find shelter.
When they reached the valley, they were immediately targeted. Mikhail was the first to die, followed by the mayor's son, and then Never. The mayor's father and mother-in-law were also killed. The mayor quickly took the injured to Askeran, and we rushed them to a hospital in Stepanakert. That's where I learned that Mikhail had already died, though they told me that Never was still alive. Never's hand was cut off and his legs burned. When these things hit, it burns your body. Mikhail had his throat cut.
The mayor's 15-year-old son, David Alexanian, his father and his mother-in-law, were also killed. Saren was also among the injured.
When they brought Seyran in, his head was severely injured, with rocket fragments lodged in his brain. He was operated on in Karabakh by doctors Melkumian and Verdian. They told me it would be extremely difficult to save his life. Seyran was on life support. While the city was being bombed, all the parents were rushing to the basement with their children. But my child was on life support. I couldn't just turn it off and leave. As the bombing continued, the hospital windows shook. But Dr. Melkumian stayed by my side, supporting me through everything. I pleaded, "Please help me at least save this child's life." And they promised they would stay with me until the very last moment.
The first explosions on September 19th were heard in the afternoon around 1 p.m. Severd Arusamian was in Stepanakert with her two sons, 18-year-old Gurgen and 9-year-old Gor, while her husband, Mace Arusamian, was tending to livestock in the village of Hinshen. Gor was at school that day.
He didn't want to go to school that day, but I insisted, telling him he needed to go and study. In the afternoon, my mom called to say that the situation was tense and advised me to pick my son up from school.
The students were sent home, and as Gor was making his way back, a rocket exploded just a few hundred meters away from him.
My son and I ran out as the sounds of explosions grew closer and louder. We kept running, and my son sprinted ahead. Suddenly, I heard him call out Gor in a loud voice. I felt a wave of relief, thinking he had found him and they would be coming back. I stood there for about 10 minutes, but when I heard no news from them, I went to see what was happening and to urge them to hurry as the explosions continued. When I arrived, I saw Gor on the ground, surrounded by men and women. They were too scared to approach him. I didn't understand what was happening. I thought he had passed out.
Those gathered went to the basement and tried to provide Gor with medical assistance, but it was unsuccessful. Unable to call an ambulance, one of the people in the basement suggested taking the boy to the hospital in his car.
I handed Gor to Gurgen and asked him to sit in the back of the car while I carried Gor's bag, thinking that when the attack ended and he woke up, his books would be safe. I don't know what I was thinking at that moment. I sat in the front of the car, hoping that if there was an explosion, I would be hurt instead and could protect my sons.
Gor was initially taken to the military hospital, but there was no space for him there. He was then transferred to the hospital in Stepanakert.
We were sitting on the third floor in front of the intensive care unit when they called me in to see the doctors. They told me they were unable to save my child. I can't even describe the emotions I felt. I just sat on the balcony, hoping a rocket would fall there and take my life.
Gor Artsakh had died from a heart attack.
You know, I sent him to school, laughing and hugging each other that day, and then I said that I won't open that door again, because I opened that door, I sent my child to school and didn't receive him back. And I was not able to go to our house anymore. I didn't go there. My sister went with my son. They collected this toy, several paintings of Gor's. He drew me, his father, his brother. I think there is some resemblance.
In the Mardikert region, one direction of the Azerbaijani offensive targeted Nurkanhorda. 61-year-old Julieta Golshan and her 9-year-old grandson Areg Gasparian were killed in their home. Around 9 in the evening, a rocket struck the Golstein residence, completely destroying the house and leaving the bodies of Areg and Julieta trapped beneath the rubble. According to Arthur, Julieta's son, Areg was found in his grandmother's arms, as she had tried to shield him with her body. The Hovoyan family was also residing in Mardikert. Following the 2020 war, they settled in the village of Kalatak. Goharian sold candles in Hekobavink, while her husband, Vazkin, worked as a guard. Their older son, Sergei, often assisted his father with construction work. There was no job he wouldn't do with me. He was bigger than me. Sergei Hovoyan was just 16 years old and aspired to continue his education in college.
ծրագրավորում ինքը շատ էր
He hoped to become either a programmer or an economist.
շատ զուսպ
As there was a blockade, I had applied for the evacuation of my family.
մեզ դուրս հանեին
Bahrain was informed that they could leave for Armenia on September 20th, but September 19 changed their lives completely.
On September 19, we were in the village of Vank, at Father Hovanes's house. We had lunch at around 1 p.m., and when I got up to clean the table, the sounds of the explosions were heard.
Mulsik Bagdasarian, who lived in Vank, had gone to Father Hovanes's house to warn them about the impending attack, after escorting the children from their neighborhood to a basement.
As soon as he stepped outside, explosions occurred, killing him in the yard. After the blast, I woke up to my husband yelling Sergei.
որ գոռաց Սերգեն գնացի հյուրասենյակ տեսա որ
When he called out to Sergei, I went to the living room and saw that my elder son was lying on one side, my younger son on the other. Father Hovanes was also injured. It was a horrific scene.
տեսարաններ
Among those in the house, only her husband, Vazkan Hovoyan, was not injured. After the shelling, he called the village nurse and took the injured to the hospital in Vank. If something had happened to me, if I had been seriously injured, my entire family, along with Father Hovanes, would have perished on the spot, and no one would have known where we were. First, I ran to my son, Serge, and checked for his pulse. It was there. I laid him on the ground and provided medical assistance to Gaharina and Mikurdiich, tying their severed veins to stem the bleeding. I used parts of the curtains to do this. It was all I could find at the time. After that, I checked Serge's pulse again, and it was still there until we reached Vank. Our nurse administered an injection, and it worked. We then moved toward the checkpoint in Stepanakert, but once we arrived, the injection had stopped working.
սկորիում ես տեղափոխել են Ստեփանակերտ
The ambulance took us to the hospital in Stepanakert, and we were the first injured to arrive there. Upon admission, my younger son was taken to the children's hospital, where many injured civilians were being treated. There were so many of them.
Այդտեղ արդեն բերեցին շատ քաղաքացիական վիրավորում ստացածներ շատ էին
I underwent a tomography, and as I was being released, I saw my older son being brought in. In that moment, I thought to myself that he was alive.
որ ինքը ողջ է
Bahrain's surgery lasted 7 hours, until September 20.
ամուսինս
My husband came to me and I asked, "How are the kids?" He told me they were fine, so I requested him to take their pictures and bring them to me.
ամուսինս փոքր տղայս նկարում է բերում եմ ասում եմ Սերգեն ուրա
He took a photo of my younger son, and when I asked about Sergei, he said the doctors hadn't allowed anyone into his room because he was seriously injured.
The fragment of the rocket had entered Sergei's heart. He had died before reaching the hospital. The bodies of those who fell victim to the Azerbaijani aggression were difficult to recover. Due to the offensive, the main road taking from the regions to Stepanakert were closed, because of which it took a few days to recover their bodies from the villages. The bodies of the killed civilians of Sarnakbir was only possible to recover from the village after 4 days.
The Azerbaijanis told us that they were going to burn the bodies. On the fourth day, the International Red Cross organized their recovery. One Armenian, one Azeri, and one Russian took the dead civilians' bodies out.
On September 24th, the Hakkari Bridge was opened, allowing the population of Artsakh to evacuate. During the evacuation, due to the lack of food and medicine, 69 people died. On September 25th, the Hetq petrol depot exploded worsening the humanitarian crisis in Artsakh. The blast killed 219 people and injured another 290. 22 people are still missing.
I said that I was either going to stay with my child or take him with me.
Borusimyan's family had already buried him in Stepanakert's fraternal cemetery.
One was happy to get a single flower from a neighbor. I don't know. We were doing it all under heavy shelling. I can't describe the situation.
However, during the forced evacuation, his family moved his remains to Armenia.
If I was sure that the Turks were not going to desecrate the graves, maybe I would like him to stay in our homeland. But I wasn't sure of it, and I was scared. We managed to take his body out. My husband and brother recovered his body with their own hands and brought the child to Yerevan, reburied him in Abovyan.
The Hovoyan's family was told that Azerbaijan required for the dead civilians to be evacuated in coffins, and for the military personnel in plastic bags. There was no single door in the Artsakh government that I didn't open to find a solution.
My husband searched everywhere for a coffin. We were able to find one through acquaintances. It was an order, but it was not bought because it had been too small. We transported my son to Goris on September 24 in a coffin where his body could barely fit. We survived by accident, but the colors of our lives are lost. Perhaps our purpose of living was lost.
Many of those who survived the displacement have shrapnel injuries and therefore need treatment and care. Seren's eyesight is deteriorating. He is in pain due to fragments left in his head, but the family cannot cover the cost of the treatment.
On the 19th, it will be a year since it had happened, but he still remembers everything very clearly. He says, "Mom, I saw what happened to Nevo. I saw what happened to Miko."
Goharian Hovoyan had undergone many surgeries. She has suffered injuries of hands, intestines and liver. She needs someone to take care of her, but her priority is her son's, Mekerdic's treatment, who has also suffered a lot of injuries. He won't show his feelings, but you can see just by looking at his face that it's really hard for him. There's too much sun, that's why I don't want him to come here. We don't want him to stay under the sun for too long, otherwise the fragments inside him heat up, and he feels bad. A year has passed after Artsakh Armenians' depopulation. The comprehensiveness of the events overshadowed the individual families' personal tragedies. The survivors are today alone with their loss. We saw all this pain, and now we have to build our son's grave by our own hands. What could be worse than that?